I'm Bobby from Geeky Bobbin. I'm here to show you a few tips about foundation paper piecing, especially when you're sewing long strip sets like for my glitch quilt pattern. A few things to know about foundation paper piecing. I don't know if this terminology is universal, but this is what I call things. I'm calling this paper my foundation. I stitch on the solid lines in this pattern, and the dashed lines are my seam allowance for the outside of the unit that I'm sewing. Each individual piece of fabric that you sew onto the foundation, I'm calling a foundation piece. So in this case, we've got A1 and B2 and A3, and then a few different B4s. Those letters correspond to the fabric that you're using. So in the pattern, it says which color to use for A and B for each of the strips. The numbers indicate the order in which you're going to sew that fabric on. So we're going to start with number 1, then add number 2 and 3 and 4. There are a few things that I like to do to get myself ready before I even start sewing. I like to use pencil crayons to mark right on the foundation the color name or fabric name if there's a print. That will help me know which piece goes where. So I've got my gray fabric and my aqua fabric, and I have it marked out on the foundation. Gray, aqua, gray, aqua. A lot of foundation paper piecing patterns will have you pre-cut your fabric into something that's close to the shape of what you're going to have in the end. In this case, we have our strips cut down fairly accurately, so we've only got a little bit over 1/4 inch on each side. So that means that we're going to have as little waste as possible when we're actually doing our sewing. Now, when you have a foundation paper piecing pattern that has that little wiggle room, it's important to make sure that you have your fabric lined up properly under your paper. Two things that can really help with that. I trim my foundation papers to just outside my seam allowance. So I'm going to take this paper and I'm going to fold it along my stitch line. Folding that in advance helps me to be able to double check that my seam allowance is accurate. So I lay my gray strip right sides together with my aqua strip. And you'll notice over here I don't have them lined up perfectly. I have a little bit of an offset there. And the reason for that is when I lay my foundation over top, I don't need to have the aqua fabric over here. I just need it to start from right here. I want to make sure I have a 1/4 inch-ish seam allowance beyond this fold line. And I want to make sure that I'm as close as I can be to that dashed seam allowance line. I'm going to grab some pins and get pinning. I like to use a lot of pins when I am doing long strips. Most of the time I stay away from pins, but when I'm foundation paper piecing strip sets, especially the longer ones, I want to make sure that things don't shift on me, especially since I have so little wiggle room or so much efficiency. I'm pinning about every couple of inches, and I'm trying to keep my pins a little further away from my stitch line. That way they won't be in the way of my presser foot. Every once in a while I just pull back the paper to that fold and check that my seam allowance is okay. And I check over here as well. As I get closer to the end, it's easier for me to see where my fabric sits relative to my seam allowances, so I don't have to flip it over to check as much. Let's take a look at the back. Looks pretty straight. All right, let's take this over to the sewing machine. Before I start stitching, I'm going to turn my stitch length down a little bit. I want my stitches to be closer together. That way, when I'm ripping the paper out, it's going to already be perforated, so I won't have to do much tearing. I don't want it to be too small in case I need to do any seam ripping, so I'm going to go with around like a 1.7. Put my presser foot down, my needle down. I take a couple stitches and then inside the seam allowance, I reverse. What that's going to do is it's going to just lock in the stitches, so that way when I'm pulling the papers out, it won't rip out the first few stitches. Let's see how we did. I'm going to take out my pins. So you can see for the most part I stitched just on the line. Maybe I went a little bit wobbly in some places, but for the most part it's right on there. The next thing I need to do is I need to fold this open and press it. You can either iron, which is what I usually do, you can finger press, or you can use a seam roller. Now I recently discovered that a roll of tape makes a pretty good seam roller. I'm just applying a lot of pressure, pushing straight down, not distorting my fabric at all. Trying to make sure that it's folded over. It actually does a really good job. One nice thing about foundation paper piecing is you don't need to have an accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance. You can have a little bit less or a little bit more and it doesn't make a huge lot of difference. If I look over here, I've got a bit over 1/8 of an inch in seam allowance, and that's probably gonna be okay. So I'm gonna just keep going with it. Now before I attach my third strip, my next gray strip, I'm going to trim off the excess over here. I have a rotary cutter that I reserve just for foundation paper piecing. That way, if I'm cutting through paper, I don't mind that it's already a little bit dull. Usually I will demote my rotary cutter blades to this cutter when I change them out. I'm trimming just beyond my seam allowance dashed line. And the same on the other side. So these extra strips here are actually going to come in really handy when I get to one of my single triangle foundations. As you can see, that's going to fit really nicely. That's not quite wide enough for that, but it'll fit in right there. So very little waste, and since we've cut all of our strips at 45-degree angles when we're trimming, we don't have to trim anything off that end. It's pretty nice. So now I just keep going. I attach the next strip, right sides together. Over here on this side, I want to make sure that this point is going to be covered when I unfold my fabric. So again, I'm folding over on the stitch line. And since this is folded over, I can check that this corner here is going to be covered. I'm lining up my raw edges and I'm going to pin. All right, that's all pinned and ready to go. Let's get stitching. Three strips, all stitched together. I'm going to trim off my ends. The next thing I need to do is cut apart my 4 triangle units. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm just cutting right in between the 2 seam allowance lines. That leaves us a little bit of wiggle room for when we're squaring up our blocks at the end. And the last thing we're going to do is we're going to stitch on an aqua triangle for B4 on the tip of each one. And for that, I'm going to use the leftover scrap that I had. So it's the exact same thing as we did before. We're going to fold back on the stitch line, make sure that this triangle that you can see there through the paper is completely covered, and pin it into place. Right, let's stitch it. Take out the pins. Fold it open. Looks like we're good. And now I can trim again. One finished triangle. And I have my 45-degree angle all ready to go for the next one. So I can see over here this little dog ear is going to go beyond where my seam allowance line is. That helps me to know that everything is lined up the way it needs to be. Just gonna pin and sew. I think what people find the trickiest about foundation paper piecing is this whole aspect of the angle being mirrored. It seems like that should be the right angle for the fabric to go on, but it's actually not, because if I went here, then when I fold it open, I've wasted this bit and I might have made a mistake there. So that's why we fold the paper back and we use the edge of the paper to judge whether or not my strip fits. If I'm lucky, this scrap will be just enough to do the last one. Oh, that makes me happy. I love efficiency. Take out the pins. Oops. I got too enthusiastic about efficiency there. And I didn't make sure that my fabrics were right sides together. So I'm gonna be ripping that one out. Let's try that again, shall we? This time with the right sides together. Much better. That's yet another reason to fold it open before you trim. Oh, there you have it. 4 triangle units done in barely any time at all, with very little waste. Look, these tiny little triangles are the only waste from the whole 4 strips. I hope you like my efficient take on foundation paper piecing. If you do, check out my patterns below. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Happy stitching!
If you like the look of the glitch quilt, you can head over to geekybobbin.com and join the glitch along. From August 19th to October 27th, a huge group of us are going to be making this quilt together. You can also head over to my Instagram page and check out #glitchalong to see some inspiration from other makers.